There's a very good reason why Wonder Woman was such a big deal upon its release in May of 2017. Why, you ask? Well, first and foremost, this was the first ever live-action Wonder Woman movie, something that comic book fans like myself have been waiting decades for. Second is that the DCU was coming off some huge stinkers, with Batman v Superman and Suicide Squad serving to be huge disappointments. Wonder Woman broke the glass ceiling as it proved that female-led superhero movies could be successful. Director Patty Jenkins and Gal Gadot made such a perfect team, with Wonder Woman being presented as a complex, layered individual who is battling to bring an end to all war. It's such a thrilling blockbuster that has real heart and soul. There's just so many things to love about this movie. From Gal Gadot, who absolutely slayed it as Wonder Woman herself, the chemistry between her and Chris Pine is absolutely top-notch. And let's not forget about the infamous No Man's Land sequence, which was absolutely dazzling. I still get goosebumps every time I watch that scene. Now, the third act is a bit clunky, especially when it came to the typical one-note villain trope, especially when it came to the dodgy CGI battle. But I was willing to let it slide because 2/3 of this movie more than makes up for it. Despite having a few tiny weak points, Wonder Woman still remains one of the best and most important superhero movies of the last 10 years.
Now, the Dark Knight trilogy is easily one of the greatest movie trilogies of all time, and this was a great way to kickstart it. Unlike a lot of other superhero movies, which are often over-the-top cartoonish, this one has a gritty sense of realism to it, making it feel like something that could actually occur in the real world. The movie does an excellent job of delving into Bruce Wayne's backstory and showing us his motivation for becoming Batman, allowing us to sympathize with him as a person. Christian Bale does a spectacular job portraying the more human elements and emotional complexity of the character, while also the badass Batman persona we all know and love. The villains in this movie are also really great and memorable, which is often a problem with many superhero films, is that the villains are very bland and generic. And while I do think it isn't quite as good as the other two, that isn't at all a slight against it, as it's still a masterpiece and one of the greatest comic book films of all time.
I know The Dark Knight being this slow is probably a shocker for some, but that's just because I like a few other comic book movies just a little bit more. Nevertheless, The Dark Knight is still one of the greatest films to come out of the genre, and overall one of the greatest movies of all time. There's honestly so much to talk about, but to keep it brief, this was a phenomenal middle chapter for the Dark Knight trilogy. Christopher Nolan did an excellent job creating the world and establishing the character of Bruce Wayne with Batman Begins, which is arguably my favorite reboot of all time. Then once that was established, Nolan decided to kick the intensity into gear with a full-blown action movie as a sequel, and it tremendously paid off. I've always admired how Nolan waited until the second movie to bring out the most iconic villain in comic book history with Heath Ledger's Joker, one of the greatest performances ever given by an actor. Everyone else in the movie, from Christian Bale to Maggie Gyllenhaal, Michael Caine, Morgan Freeman, Gary Oldman, and Aaron Eckhart, all give spectacular performances in addition to Ledger. The action sequences and spectacle are top-notch, definitely the best in the trilogy, and the incredibly complex themes brought to the forefront in the script are absolutely genius. I could go on all day about how special The Dark Knight is, but I think I've made my point. And as a Christopher Nolan fan, it absolutely gets my stamp of approval.
Sam Raimi's original Spider-Man was such a revelation when it was released back in May of 2002. Out of all the live-action comic book origin stories, this will always be my absolute favorite as it perfectly captures the essence of what makes Spider-Man so great while honoring the original Stan Lee Steve Ditko comics of the 60s so well. Tobey Maguire to me is still the gold standard actor to play Spider-Man / Peter Parker, giving a performance that was every inch the quintessential dorky wide-eyed hero that had been seen in the comics from the 60s. In addition, you also have Willem Dafoe's maniacal turn as the Green Goblin, putting in a phenomenal Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde performance that's just absolutely intriguing. Sure, some aspects of this movie may not hold up that well for most people these days, but with the right amount of blend of popcorn cinema beats, dramatic scenes, and a sprinkle of B-movie flourish, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man is a good old-fashioned origin story done to perfection.
Now, I remember seeing this movie for the first time in the theater and just being blown away by how great it was. Everything about this movie just works super well, whether it came to the emotion, humor, cinematography, action. I mean, they really managed to pull it off. One of the main problems I have with MCU films is that they often go too overboard with the humor, and it will often detract from a more serious moment. But this movie managed to be effortlessly hilarious while not feeling forced or out of place. But easily the best thing about this entire film is just how absolutely phenomenal the casting and characters were, and how well they all blended together. It's just an absolute treat watching them grow from a group of rebels who originally hate each other to the lovable duo they turn into.
Although the Avengers may seem kind of generic by today's standards, the film was a game changer when it came out. This was the first superhero team-up movie that showed how long-form storytelling across multiple films can create an epic climactic resolution. The Avengers did an excellent job of bringing together the 6 characters we came to love through the first 5 movies in the MCU. The characters work so well together, and it's interesting to watch the dynamic of heroes having to learn to work together. I love the message that the Avengers has about teamwork and how it's our differences that make us special, but how we are still the strongest when we work together. The action sequences in the Avengers still hold up really well, the humor is very well balanced and gave us so many iconic memes. We have a phenomenal villain in Tom Hiddleston's Loki, and this is one of those rare occasions where a recasting was actually better than the original, as Mark Ruffalo replaces Edward Norton as Bruce Banner. Overall, The Avengers is still a very fun movie after all these years, and it created the blueprint that every superhero team-up movie made today follows. And even though I've not been a big fan of Joss Whedon as of recently, he did the genre a solid with this entry.
Even though it's a damn shame that the MCU have been on a massive decline in its quality with their shows and movies for the past few years. However, when it comes to discussing Captain America Civil War, it's one of the films that really showcased the franchise at its peak. Unlike most other films in the franchise, Civil War had the most mature approach, as it's perhaps the most character-driven film of the whole MCU. It's a detailed examination between the two conflicting ideologies of Captain America and Iron Man, as the Russo brothers did such a spectacular job of making you choose carefully of whose side you want to be on. It's an argument that you don't automatically choose on the fly, because not only do both have valid points on their side, but they both have their flaws, which makes the animosity between Tony Stark and Steve Rogers all the more compelling. From the iconic airport clash sequence, to the introductions of Chadwick Boseman's Black Panther and Tom Holland's Spider-Man, and most importantly demonstrating the strong friendship between Captain America and Bucky Barnes, Captain America Civil War is unquestionably one of the greatest installments of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and it's a damn shame that the franchise will never be as good as it was.
Now, Batman is my absolute favorite superhero, so a lot of my picks on this list are going to consist of films with him in it. This movie was the perfect conclusion to one of the greatest movie trilogies and really tied everything up in an extremely satisfying way. It has the dark tone that made the 2 previous films so marvelous, and out of all of them, this is the one where the stakes feel the highest, as it has the vibe of a doomsday film where anyone can die at like any moment. Bane, while obviously not as good as the Joker, was still an incredible villain given an excellent performance by Tom Hardy. Anne Hathaway was also great as Catwoman, who was a great addition to the film, and Christian Bale killed it always as Batman. The action is also fantastic, and the ending is super emotional and might even make some viewers shed a tear.
After becoming a beloved character in the MCU, Thor needed to have the best movie possible for his character. The first Thor was great, and he was awesome in the first 2 Avengers movies, but unfortunately, Thor the Dark World left a lot to be desired for me. Thankfully, Taika Waititi gave Thor a badass third entry into the franchise. Thor Ragnarok still stands as the best Thor movie in my opinion. I love the way that the Ragnarok lore is explored in this film. Thor had a badass transformation after he suffered through some losses. It was awesome to watch Thor and Loki have to team up to save Asgard from the monstrous Hela, who by the way was played fantastically by Cate Blanchett. And Hulk had a great arc too, especially after how polarizing his arc was in Age of Ultron. Taika really brought out the best in Thor with great writing, striking the perfect balance of comedy and seriousness. The style of the film is dazzling and allows for some awesome action sequences. The Led Zeppelin soundtrack is killer, and the addition of Valkyrie was awesome too. Overall, Thor Ragnarok is in my opinion the best story we've ever gotten out of Thor's character. It sets him up perfectly for Infinity War and Endgame, and it still stands out as one of the most compelling stories in the MCU. And as a huge fan of Thor, this is absolutely my favorite entry in his franchise.
Based on the 1989 comic book series of the same name by James O'Barr, The Crow tells the tale of an edgy musician, Eric Draven, who's resurrected from the dead, whom is bound to seek vengeance against a gang who murdered him and his fiancée with the help of a police officer played by Ernie Hudson. The horror action genre aspects are so dazzling, with having some real visual flair in its fight scenes, as well as an impressive overall gothic aesthetics. Not to mention the fact that Brandon Lee did such a superb job of portraying the character of Eric Draven, who comes off so real, yet so very vulnerable. It just makes it even more depressing that he died during the film's production, literally a week before it was set to end. Despite the onset tragedy during the film's production of Brandon Lee, The Crow was and still remains a cult classic that deserves every ounce of recognition and praise it gets.
Now, this movie highly exceeded my expectations when I saw it in the theater, as after many disappointing superhero films in the past few years, this was just a huge treat. What was so unique about this movie is how it played off as a superhero film while also being akin to a dark thriller such as Seven. Robert Pattinson did a great job as Batman, who was honestly much better than I thought he would be. Riddler was also an incredible villain who, despite not having quite as much screen time, managed to be super captivating just from the threat of him alone. And the final moment with him really had me on the edge of my seat. I also really appreciated how this movie did an awesome job of utilizing Batman's detective skills, which I feel isn't as prominent in other Batman films. And despite being 3 hours long, the pacing is still exceptional and each scene is thoroughly entertaining.
Now, I'm a big Spider-Man fan, and the first film to introduce the character still holds up phenomenally well after all these years. Sam Raimi's Spider-Man was a monumental achievement for the comic book movie genre, as it showed that you could take a fan-favorite comic book character and portray them in a serious light with real emotions, and not just as some action movie to pass the time. The characters in Spider-Man are so well written and fleshed out, and of course brilliantly acted. I will always love Tobey Maguire's authentic and hyper-emotional performance as Peter Parker. Willem Dafoe gives an all-time great villain performance as the Green Goblin. Cliff Robertson's contributions as Uncle Ben's are short but still so impactful. And the other supporting actors like Kirsten Dunst, Rosemary Harris, and James Franco help bring these beloved comic book characters to life. Spider-Man may be an early entry to the genre, but it still holds up so well as it set up the formula for virtually every other superhero origin story movie that came after it, helping it stand out from other comic book movies during its time. It's because of this and Bryan Singer's first X-Men movie that helped make the genre what it is today, which is why Spider-Man will always be an essential superhero movie in my book.
If I could name one movie that I instantly loved on the first viewing, it's without question Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. Into the Spider-Verse is an endlessly creative, visually jaw-dropping, and groundbreaking animated comic book movie that has such a beautiful story about a band of misfits finding strength together. From the pitch-perfect soundtrack to the stunning animation style that matches the feel of a comic book being brought to life, Into the Spider-Verse is such an absolute pure joy to watch every time, as it not only manages to be one of the greatest comic book movies of all time, but also one of the greatest anime movies of all time as well.
This movie is the perfect example on how to end off one of the most beloved characters of all time in the most satisfying way possible. Hugh Jackman gives by far his best performance as Logan and probably the best of his entire career. He brought just so much range and versatility to the role and perfectly captured Logan's deteriorating emotional state throughout. Patrick Stewart also gave his best performance as Charles Xavier, and Daphne King killed it as Laura, which was one of the best child performances I've ever seen. The film is incredibly bleak and depressing throughout, which was a great departure in tone from the previous films, as it shows the ramifications of getting older and gives an important lesson on not to take your life for granted and appreciate it while it lasts. The action here is incredibly badass, mainly due to how brutal it is compared to previous films and how it doesn't hold back. The ending is also really great, but sad at the same time, and is one of the only times I probably shed a tear while watching a movie.
Now, I know that calling a movie that's only about 3 years old an all-time favorite might seem a bit excessive, but as a Spider-Man fan, this is everything I ever wanted in a movie like this. I loved being able to watch all three live-action Spider-Man actors come together for one big epic and emotional story. The three of them work so well together, and they all get to show their own individual strengths as Spider-Man. It was awesome to see three beloved interpretations of the same character come together to share their common experiences and differences, showing that Spider-Man really is whoever he decides to be. It reminded me of the themes from Into the Spider-Verse, but with its own fan service-oriented spin. It was also refreshing to see Tobey and Andrew have redemption arcs, as the last movies in each of their franchises were easily the weakest. It also did a good job of balancing having a lot of villains, which is what some of the older Spider-Man films had a hard time doing. I loved seeing the old villains return with their original actors and see how carefully the writers handled their arcs. The supporting characters are also fantastic, with Ned, MJ, Aunt May, and of course Doctor Strange. Spider-Man No Way Home was a risky project that could have ended horribly, but the writers were careful to make sure that the fans were pleased and that everything was well balanced. Overall, Spider-Man No Way Home is an epic, fun, and of course emotional story that was handled gracefully and paid off tremendously for Spider-Man fans, myself included.
With the original Fox X-Men movie reinvigorating the comic book movie genre back in 2000, X2 X-Men United would be a huge improvement by cranking things up to 11, as it beautifully adapts from the 1982 graphic novel God Loves, Man Kills. What I really love about X2 is the way how it did such a superb job by digging deep to create parallels with issues in society. It allows us to see these characters that were introduced in the first movie fleshed out into more than just superheroes. Characters with complex emotions, complicated past, and they acted as powerful symbols for anyone who's ever felt like an outcast for whatever reason, whether if it's because of the color of their skin or their sexual orientation. In addition, this movie is packed with a handful of excellent action sequences, from the fantastic opening sequence with the White House invasion introducing us to Nightcrawler, to Wolverine's rampage during the X-Mansion invasion, and even Wolverine's showdown with Lady Deathstrike. Oh, and I can't forget to mention the brilliant cliffhanger with Jean Grey sacrificing herself to save the X-Men, teasing the Dark Phoenix storyline, and although the results of that may have been very anticlimactic in X-Men The Last Stand, it still was a great moment nonetheless. X2 X-Men United is a movie that is worth acknowledging and worth celebrating. Not only is it one of the best entries in the Fox X-Men movie franchise, but in my opinion, one of the best comic book movies ever made.
This is easily one of the funniest and most entertaining movies I've ever seen. No matter how many times I watch it, it never fails to have me burst out laughing. Ryan Reynolds was absolutely born to play Deadpool and brings so much personality and humor to the role that he just sucks you in from start to finish. Besides that, though, every other character in this movie is incredibly fun to watch, with a few standouts being Colossus and Weasel. Even the villains, despite not being the most fleshed out, are still memorable, and it handles it pretty well. And while the plot on paper may appear to be relatively simple, it's absolutely made up just by how absolutely hilarious it is. The movie also does have its fair share of heart-touching moments too, specifically involving Wade and Vanessa, which contrasted surprisingly well with the more lighthearted tone of the film. There's also a nice dosage of bloody violence, which was refreshing considering how watered down the action is in most superhero movies.
Captain America is my favorite superhero of all time, and the third entry in his franchise is easily everything I could have asked for as a Captain America fan. Everything about Captain America Civil War was handled so incredibly well. The story of how the politicians divide the Avengers is top-notch and handled with finesse. The script gives all the characters enough space to explain where they're all coming from and why they feel the way they do. It was very refreshing to have a superhero movie where the superheroes have to battle each other in the interest of humanity. It's that kind of risk-taking that I wish more comic book movies would do. Of course, all of the actors we've come to know and love are phenomenal. The late Chadwick Boseman had a very compelling debut as the Black Panther, and it set him up perfectly for his first film. Tom Holland has a very fun and lovable debut as Peter Parker, truly capturing that youthful energy of Spider-Man. And I of course have to mention Daniel Bruhl, who makes a fantastic villain in Zemo. And of course I can't talk about this movie without mentioning the airport battle. Just like Spider-Man No Way Home, Captain America Civil War is a big risk for Marvel that paid off tremendously due to how carefully crafted it was. This is also why I feel Steve Rogers' Captain America had the most consistent arc in the MCU. All three of his movies were excellent, and he had some of the best moments in the Avengers saga, which is why Captain America Civil War is my favorite storyline for my favorite superhero of all time.
I mean, what can I say about The Dark Knight that hasn't been said already? It's a modern classic. It's a movie that not only just set the bar high for just comic book movies, but for movies in general. Despite being a superhero movie, it's also a crime drama of epic proportions with tight plotting and cleverly drawn characters. It's a film that successfully attempted to make a superhero movie appear realistic in a way of how it tells a story. And of course, let's talk about Heath Ledger's iconic performance as the Joker. I don't think I'll ever be truly convinced that was Heath Ledger under all that makeup. His portrayal of the Joker is arguably the best and greatest incarnation of the Joker to date. Ledger's Joker was like a more chaotic, unpredictable, unhinged madman that just felt like a loose cannon rather than falling for that typical goofball, funny villain shtick from the comic book. It was like a completely different actor under all that makeup, which just shows how fucking magnificent Heath Ledger was. And while Maggie Gyllenhaal, Michael Caine, Gary Oldman, Aaron Eckhart, and Christian give it their all, Heath Ledger's Joker just simply steals the show. From the abundance of iconic quotes, the gritty tone, the excellent score composed by Hans Zimmer, and all-around great acting, The Dark Knight is not only just the greatest comic book movie ever made, but also the best movies ever made as well.
This isn't just arguably the best superhero movie ever made, but probably a top 10 movie of all time. Heath Ledger delivers the greatest performance to ever appear in a comic book film as Joker. Like, words can't even describe how monumental he was in that role, and portrayed the chaotic nature of the Joker to absolute perfection. It's just impossible not to love him, despite how much of an evil monster he is, because he's just so wildly entertaining and charismatic. Even though Heath Ledger is the absolute show stealer here, the rest of the performances are phenomenal as well, specifically from Christian Bale, Aaron Eckhart, and Gary Oldman. Everything about this movie is just absolutely flawless. It has some of the greatest pacing in any movie, as there's never a dull moment and it flows like water from start to finish. The action is intense and visceral, the editing is slick and tight, the cinematography and musical score are mesmerizing, and it has some of the most quotable dialogue of all time. This will likely always be the greatest comic book film, and it's hard to see anything beating it.
The first Spider-Man movie felt like the perfect introduction to the character, and yet somehow Spider-Man 2 is even better. I think the story of Spider-Man 2 is a perfect follow-up as it explores the themes of struggling to find balance as a superhero. Sam Raimi was able to take this fantastical job of being a superhero and bring it down to a grounded level of humanity. Tobey Maguire once again strikes back with another terrific performance, showing us more nuance to Peter Parker. Kirsten Dunst, James Franco, and Rosemary Harris are once again great as ever, and Alfred Molina gives us an all-time great villain with Dr. Otto Octavius, and those were big shoes to fill following Willem Dafoe's Green Goblin. Oh, and of course I can't forget the train sequence. The story of Spider-Man 2 is so well nuanced and executed to perfection. It's one of the greatest sequels ever made, and it's my all-time favorite story arc for the character of Spider-Man.
I mean, come on, you already know what my number one was gonna be. Well, I may have rearranged this list a couple times, but the one that never changed was my number one, Spider-Man 2, the second and undeniably the best installment of Sam Raimi's genre-defying Spidey trilogy. Suiting up for his most personal journey yet, Peter Parker is just a literal punching bag throughout the entire runtime of the film, as he not only struggles having a normal life, but also being Spider-Man simultaneously. To coming face-to-face with the tragic yet dangerous Doc Ock, played by Alfred Molina, to Mary Jane wanting nothing to do with him despite trying his best to be there for her, and even his best friend Harry, who desperately attempts to unmask the so-called hero that he believes murdered his father in the previous film. Featuring a slew of remarkable performances from the entire cast, Spider-Man 2 is also notable for its epic action sequences, most famously the train scene, which is, as they say, peak cinema.
While this might not technically count as a superhero movie, as it's more about a supervillain, I'm still counting it since the character is still part of a superhero universe. While The Dark Knight is definitely the better film objectively speaking, this is my personal favorite, not just comic book film, but currently favorite movie of all time. This movie, just to me, speaks to me on so many levels, and in a way not many other films do. And yes, while the character isn't really someone who should be idolized and he ends up doing some pretty questionable things, this is a film that anyone who's ever felt like an outcast or that they don't fit in with the rest of society can highly identify with. Joaquin Phoenix's performance here was absolutely impeccable and arguably the greatest of his entire career. I honestly think it's almost as good as Heath Ledger's performance, just in a different way. While Ledger portrayed the pure evil Joker who just wants to cause chaos, Phoenix makes him incredibly sympathetic and someone you just feel sorry for. He truly mastered everything in this role, whether it came to the facial expressions, laughter, delivery, crying, to create a character that feels as real and authentic as possible. This is honestly a film I think should be vital for everyone to watch at least once, as it really makes you reconsider how you treat people and encourages you to be kinder, and shows how even just a little bit of mistreatment and neglect on your behalf can all add up and possibly cause someone to eventually snap and do something catastrophic.
Now, I know I might be cheating a little bit by going with two parts of a story combined, but I have good reason as to why. Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame was everything I wanted in a Marvel movie since I was a kid. This was the epic climactic finale that the MCU fans had been wanting since the first Avengers movie. These two movies to me are the best examples of how long-form storytelling can have a tremendous payoff and how there's an unreal level of excitement and anticipation. Avengers Infinity War did an excellent job of making the characters we know and love feel as if they were truly in danger, and Avengers Endgame did an incredible job of making the Avengers feel more human than they ever have, and gave us a well-deserved satisfying finale that we had all been waiting for. And as someone who had been a Marvel fan since childhood, these movies meant everything to me. If I had to pick a favorite, I would go with Endgame. I know that might be a little bit controversial, but Endgame just hit all the right emotional beats for me, and felt like the more satisfying conclusion to the story. Robert Downey Jr. gives a truly incredible final performance as Tony Stark, and the writers absolutely did him justice with his conclusion. Black Widow was given a good send-off even if it was sad, and as a Captain America fan, I was in ecstasy over how well they handled his conclusion. I also cannot begin to tell you how happy I was that he caught that hammer. Every character had their shining moment, and I will forever love Endgame for that. And even though I do feel that the MCU has lacked consistency in recent years, I still have faith that the MCU can find its footing again and give us another satisfying climactic story. They did it before with these two, so I think they can do it again and possibly make it even more emotional. I know having Infinity War and Endgame as my number one might be considered a generic take to some, but these are just my personal favorite comic book movies of all time. And if I gave you a different entry, I would be lying to you. Which is why I am proud to say that Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame are tied for my favorite comic book movie of all time.